Hallo, liebe Zuhörerinnen und Zuhörer. Ich begrüße Sie zu einer neuesten Episode unseres Maikes Raumzeit Podcasts. Heute habe ich einen Gast bei mir aus England, weshalb wir jetzt auch diesen Podcast auf Englisch weiterführen werden. I am happy to welcome today's episodes of the podcast Maikes Raumzeit Richard Chataway. He is Director of Behavioural Science at Gobeyond Partners, best-selling author, and we will talk about behavioral science and customer behavior and how it can actually impact your business. Welcome, Richard. I'm happy to have you on that episode.
Excellent. Thank you very much, and it's great to be here.
Can I please ask you for a start to introduce you first a bit and to tell what you're doing?
Sure. So I am, as you say, Director of Behavioural Science at Gobeyond Partners. Gobeyond Partners is a global consultancy business specialising in customer journeys and service design. And my experience in applied behavioural science, I guess, goes back about 15 years. Initially, when I started working for the government in the UK on actually anti-smoking communication. So I was encouraging people to give up smoking. And having worked in sort of media and advertising for a number of years. And that was really a kind of transformational for me, I guess, in terms of my career, because I started understanding that people were not totally rational. We don't always behave in very logical ways. And one great example of that is smoking, which is something that everyone is aware is not very good for them, but people still continue to do so. And so in the work that we were doing there, we started applying principles from social psychology, experimental psychology, and what's now known as behavioral economics and behavioral science. And that was really, I found that really interesting and fascinating, and kind of opened up a new world to me in terms of understanding how people behave. And B, it proved to be very effective and a much more effective route for us to helping people with quitting smoking successfully. So much so that the UK government achieved its targets a year early in terms of reducing the amount of smokers. So for me, that was a really, transformational moment, and it kind of set me on a career path in applied behavioural science. I did a lot of my own learning. I went to work and lead communication strategy for the federal government in Australia for a number of years, and then set up my own business called Communication Science Group, applying these principles to customer experience and customer communications. And that's when I started working with Gobeyond, initially as an associate, and since last year, I joined to head up the new nudge practice that Gobeyond have created.
Can you give us, for a start, maybe a quick or short definition of behavioral science, behavioral business? What is it?
Sure.
Actually...
Yeah. So behavioral science, really, and I like to use the term more than behavioral economics or social psychology and those kind of disciplines, because behavioral science really encapsulates all of the different academic disciplines that give us a better understanding of why people do what they do and how people behave, and particularly how we make decisions as humans. So, when I say behavioral science, I'm talking about behavioral economics, which is kind of the branch of economics that looks at the decision making, social psychology, which is how people behave in society and how our psychology influences our behavior. And then also there's elements from disciplines like neuroscience, which is about how our brains work and how we make decisions in a physiological sense. Those kind of disciplines. And behavioral science really, to me, is the study of decision making. The Behaviour Business is the title of my book that I wrote in 2020, which is all about how to apply behavioural science for business success. And when I talk about a behavioural business, I guess it's those businesses that have that understanding of how people make decisions in the real world and have applied it successfully. And what I talk about in my book is that the opening line of my book is, if you're in business, you're in the business of behaviour. And what I mean by that is any business needs to understand behaviour to succeed. You need to understand why people decide to buy your products and services, or why they decide not to buy your products and services. You need to influence that behaviour to generate income, generate revenue. And also, you need to influence the way people behave who work in your business in order for them to deliver those products and services in the best way possible. You need people who are currently doing X to do Y, and that is behavior change. And behavioral science tells us and gives us frameworks for understanding why people do what they do. And that's the relevance of behavioral science. And in my book, I talk about how, to build great digital products and services, how the most successful 21st century businesses, the likes of Google, Amazon, Facebook, etc., have used behavioral science in developing their products and how it's made them successful. I also talk about how we can use behavioral science to understand how to recruit better, how to manage performance of people in our businesses better, how we can use it to gain a better understanding of our customers and customer insight, and how we can apply behavioral science to market our products and services better, to actually encourage people to buy those products and services, as well as how we, which is the core of the work that we do at Gobeyond, how we can use behavioral science to understand how to develop great customer experiences as well. So that's the behavior business is the title of my book, and I guess the theory behind that, in it as simply as possible is every business needs to understand behavior to succeed, and my book tries to give a framework of how to do that.
Yeah, you just kind of mentioned several perspective or points actually that are really interesting. So actually, my first question is: if you say as soon as you work in a company, you actually have you have to look at the customer from a behavioral perspective. How is your impression in reality? Probably everyone in a company is saying, or every company is saying that actually, yeah, we know our customers, we know how they behave, we know where they are. That's what they say. What's the reality? What's your experience on that?
That's a really good question, because one of the things that I think not enough people in business realize or understand is that and this is one of the most important things that behavioral science has told us. So, in the last, it's a relatively new discipline. I like to say we've learned more about human behavior in the last 50 years than we have in the previous 5,000 years. So there's a lot to learn, and a lot we've learned in a very short time. If you think about psychology, psychology is only about barely over 100 years old as a discipline. So there's a lot we've learned in a short space of time. And one of the most important and fundamental things is there is a big difference between what people say and what they do. And that's not because we are liars or we seek to mislead people. It's because a lot of our behavior is being influenced at a subconscious or non-conscious level, and we're not necessarily aware of those influences. So when you go to your customers and you say, what do you like about our products? What do why did you buy this particular product and not this other product? They will give you a reason for that, a conscious reason for that. But in most cases, that's probably only 50% of the answer. There's another 50% of things that are influencing their decisions that they're not consciously aware of, and they can't tell you, in response to a question like that. And so there are other things that you need to do to understand customer behavior. And, one of the key things that I talk about in my book is about, experimenting and understanding, by understanding some of those non-conscious drivers of behavior, if you can run controlled experiments to test out some of the hypotheses that behavioral science give you, then you can look at actual behavior and get a good verification of that. So to give you an example, Amazon as a product is has been obviously hugely successful and has grown incredibly fast. One of the things that Amazon wanted to try out was their Prime product. So if you're familiar with Amazon Prime, this is where you pay a monthly subscription, and you don't have to pay for delivery each time you get an item. Now, Amazon wanted to assess whether Prime was a good idea, and so they went to their econometricians within the business who modelled whether they thought Prime would be a profitable product for them. And the modelling that they conducted said that it would be a huge failure. It would cost them millions and millions of dollars a year as a product. So what Amazon said, okay, that's fine, but why don't we just run a trial with a small group of customers in the US and see, if that theory, if that modelling is accurate. And so they ran an experiment with a group of their customers in the US. And what they found was that those customers who signed up to Amazon Prime when it was offered to them spent 86% more as customers on an annual basis. And what was interesting was they weren't spending more each visit to the site, but they were visiting more often. Basically, they visited the site nearly twice as often because they had already paid for delivery, and they wanted to get their money's worth basically from that delivery. So Amazon became more of a default product for them. and it leverages what we in behavioral science is known as the power of free. Something that we feel that we're getting for free, like free delivery, we value really, really highly. So and that's a subconscious effect. It was something the modelling hadn't taken into account, and the only way that Amazon could determine that it was going to be successful for them was to test it in the real world. And having tested it with a small group of customers, obviously they saw it was going to be hugely profitable for them, and they rolled it out to the entire business. And obviously now Amazon Prime accounts for a huge proportion of their customers, so and their profitability. So that's a good example, I think, of where econometric modelling had got to some way towards the answer, but it hadn't got the full answer. And the only way to get the full answer was actually to look at real behaviour in the real world with real customers. Because if you'd have asked the customers if they thought Amazon Prime was a good idea, they probably would have gone, yeah, it sounds all right, but I don't think it's going to make me buy anymore. But then when they tried it in the real world, it had a massively transformational effect for their business.
So you're actually promoting companies to say, okay, go out there and make test tries. I mean, try and error actually with smaller customer groups.
Absolutely, yeah. So the importance of trialing and testing, that's another reason why I use the term behavioural science, is because in science, how we make advances in science is through experimentation and through testing and seeing what happens when we try our hypotheses in the real world, and that's how behavioural science advances as well. Because these behavioural biases that influence our behaviour, so these kind of mental shortcuts, rules of thumb that we use to navigate an increasingly complex world as consumers, because they are unconscious, as I've said, simply asking people about them doesn't really give you an accurate answer or an accurate picture. So the best way to get an understanding of that is to try these things out in the real world, and they are very contextual as well. So as humans, we are very influenced by the context in which we live. So these contextual factors can be very powerful, and what that means is that you need to experiment in a context that's as accurate or as representative of the real world context as possible to get a robust conclusion. So in Amazon's case, with that example I mentioned, nothing else had changed other than the customers were now prime customers rather than traditional customers paying for each delivery. So the context was wholly representative. In other, one challenge that I sometimes get with this approach is to say, well, Amazon has millions of data points on its customers. It's a digital product. They're able to run these tests at scale relatively cheaply and relatively quickly, and that's undoubtedly true. One of the things I say in my book is that I talk about how the most innovative companies run thousands and thousands of experiments every year.
Yeah.
The likes of Google are running 100,000 plus experiments every year, and then people say, well, Google has all the best computer science PhDs working for them, so it's very easy for them to run these kind of experiments.
Yeah.
They have some innate advantages, and I completely acknowledge that. But let's say you're a retailer,
yeah,
with physical stores. There's no reason why you couldn't pick one or two stores and run some small-scale experiments within them around some of these hypotheses that you've built about customer behaviour and look at the impacts of those. Now, you might say, that's not robust, there aren't enough data points, but you'll still, even if it's qualitative data, you'll still get some insights which will prove useful and that you can then start to test at greater scale. And that's not expensive. It's not going to be hugely disruptive to your business. And I still think that's very valuable. And I would say in a lot of contexts, it's probably you're going to get a better return on investment from that than, I don't know, large scale quantitative surveys, for example.
Because that would have been my question now. How do you probably need to get management on board. How do you convince a CFO or a CEO to kind of say, listen, let's do those tests and let's try it, let's say in our store, in 2 stores maybe. Because I would have said it needs budget, it needs resources such as employees, it needs space, everything. It takes it all. I mean, how do you convince them of actually giving you that freedom of testing and try?
Yeah, it's a really good question because that kind of approach and what I talk about in my book is the kind of growth mindset that's required for that, which is the understanding that that we need to test things and try things out in order to drive innovation, but also that sometimes you'll test things and find they don't work, and there's a risk involved in that. So you might run an experiment and it hasn't worked, and then you've got to go back to those senior board level members and say, we tried this, it didn't work, so we need to do something different. I think the really important thing, and the argument to be made there, is that money hasn't been wasted in terms of running that experiment, because you've learned something, and you've learned something that doesn't work, and therefore that you don't, that's somewhere you shouldn't be directing your efforts and directing your resources in future, and that's as valuable as finding something that does work, if you know what I mean. I think to convince senior level stakeholders of the importance of this kind of approach is one. The examples I use in my book, the things that Google, Amazon, Facebook, and so on have done to drive their business using behavioral science. Those have generated billions of dollars in value for those businesses. So it's hard to argue against that. I think in terms of the potential value for other businesses. And there's a really good there's a quote in my book from Rory Sutherland, who's the vice chairman of Ogilvy, who's a kind of a very well-known advocate of behavioral science generally, and hugely influential has been hugely influential for me, and wrote the foreword to my book. Rory hired me for a role at Ogilvy a number of years ago, and he says, he has this great quote, which is, "Test counterintuitive things because your competitors won't." Which is a great way of thinking about it. That because these things are counterintuitive, because as in the Amazon example, the econometricians all concluded that it wouldn't be profitable, but Amazon decided to test it anyway and found that it was something that was hugely transformational for their business. That's a competitive advantage, because
Absolutely.
if it was an obvious answer, someone would have found it already. So that's the value of this approach, I think, is because we're dealing with things that are non-obvious and often non-conscious drivers of behavior, that it will give you that competitive advantage, and that's all every business wants is competitive advantage. So.
Okay, imagine that if I'm thinking about industries such as insurances or telecommunication, where actually the product itself or service is not big of a differentiation anymore. Mm-hmm. So actually that would be the way of figuring out, how can I actually differentiate my business and what are the services that my customers need? So you speak in your book, I think, and in the white paper that you've created for Gobeyond Partners as well, about taking control of your customer journey. Can you explain that maybe as well, please?
Yeah, so I guess if we think about behavioral science as the understanding of how people make decisions in the real world, mm-hmm. and we are seeking to influence the behavior of customers mm-hmm. throughout journeys. So to give an example, you might be wanting to in the insurance world, as you mentioned, you might want to be encouraging customers to use a self-service portal. So you might be wanting them to contact you via a digital platform rather than calling, so you can manage capacity in the contact center better. Now that is a behavior that you're wanting to encourage and to influence. And so if you can successfully influence that behavior, if you can drive the channel shift into digital, then you are taking more control of that journey. And behavioral science gives us a framework and gives us tools and techniques that allow us to influence those decisions. And one example that we use in the white paper is some work we did in the banking sector in the UK, where we were working with a bank which had created a new self-service portal, and they mm-hmm. found that a lot of customers were not using it. They were still defaulting to their existing behavior, which was to pick up the phone whenever they had a query. And that was a challenge because, firstly, they were facing capacity issues mm-hmm. with the contact center. There were long wait times for customers, and obviously that was leading to a worse experience for a customer, because quite often the queries that the customers were calling up with with simple things they could do via the website very quickly, and it would, would deliver a better experience for them. So, they wanted to take control of that journey by effectively, encouraging those customers who could get a better outcome by going to the website to use the website, and those customers who needed the telephone service, because there are still obviously some requirements, whether it's because of customer needs, they might be vulnerable, they might not be comfortable with going online, or might not even have access to internet for whatever reason. And then there are, or have a very specific request that can only really be dealt with by the, using the skills that the contact center agents have. There's always going to be that need. But then there are also a lot of very simple, straightforward requests which could be better served through the website. So for that particular project, what we did was was two things. One was that we developed a series of nudges through a process we call a cognition audit, which is a process that I developed in my business CSG, which we now use at Gobeyond, where we identify things that agents could say on the phone to encourage people to use the self-service portal and mean that next time they were much more likely to use a self-service portal. And then the second thing we had to do, which was an interesting part of this project, which we didn't necessarily anticipate when we started the project, was we needed to convince the agents in the contact center that directing people to the website was the right thing to do, that directing customers to the website was the right thing to do, because understandably they were quite nervous about doing it, because one was they felt that if all the people started using the website, it could have an impact on their role in the contact center. So there was a key part where we had to say, no, it's because of capacity issues. We want you to focus on dealing with those customers who can only use the telephone for whatever reason. So, the actual calls you'll be handling will be the ones that will use more of your skills, rather than people who have very basic requests which could be dealt with through self-service. And the second thing was that actually, and this is a really interesting behavioural bias in itself, the agents in the contact centre had a really biased view of the website, because they were only getting calls from people who'd gone to the website and had a bad experience and had to pick up the phone. So, because obviously if you think about your own behaviour, you go to a website, you get what you need. Why are you going to call the contact centre? You're not going to call the contact centre. So they had a misconception. It's what we call survivorship bias in behavioural science, which is, if you focus on one data point, you're only going to, you're going to get a biased picture as a result of that. So they only saw the bad stuff. They didn't see the good stuff. Absolutely. So they thought the website was terrible because all they heard all day was calls from customers going, I couldn't get what I needed on the website. So a key part of the training was to show them the website is actually great, and you're not hearing from 97% of customers who go on the website and get what they need and get it a successful resolution. And then once we'd done that in the training, once we'd built the evidence base for them around, no, you've got this biased picture, but also there are capacity issues which we are dealing with through this program that will mean you can focus on the job you were hired to do, basically, to deal with customers who need the support of the contact center. They were really on board with it, and then what it meant was that they felt comfortable in recommending the website to customers, and we could then deploy nudges within the conversation to say, we have this great website, you should be, you can use it for this type of query, or next time. One of the most successful things we did was we got them to end a call by saying, you can find the answer to most queries on a website, but if you can't get what you need there, come back to us at the contact center. Because previously they just used to end a call by saying something like, if you have any problems, just give us a call back. We're here 24 hours a day. And obviously what you're doing there, you understand the framing of that is basically keep calling, which is reinforcing the habit that we wanted to change. So the new script, which said, go to the website in the first instance, if you can't get what you need there, call us back, is both positioning the contact center as the experts, if you like, but also it's making clear that the default behavior should be going to the website first. And all of those things overall, we result in a 14% channel shift. So 14% of customers used the website the next time they contacted the bank. 40% more, sorry, I should say. customers started using the website, which was a huge channel shift for them. This is a bank with 20 million plus customers in the UK. So, massive impact.
So that's what you mentioned earlier. You're saying on one hand, yes, you need to understand your customer and your customer journeys, but you need as well to bring your employees on board, actually, to make them understand how to bring a good experience to your customers and why and how. That's very interesting, that you need to work on both sides. You need to get the employees on board and to make them understand how to provide a good experience to your customers and understand the customers, so that there is a common understanding actually there.
Yes, really good point, and really critical to effectively using behavioural science. As I said before, or at the very beginning, and this is it's the opening of my book. Behavioural science is really critical in understanding your customers and understanding how you can influence them, but it's also critical to understanding the behaviour of people within your business. And you can't successfully do one without the other. So, that's why when we come to applying nudges within contact centers, we've had a lot of success in doing this. Training is really critical. You can't just create a new script using behavioral science techniques and then hand it to people and say this. Because without training them, without them understanding the why as well as the how of implementing. Because firstly, it won't sound convincing if someone's reading from a script and it's something they don't necessarily believe in or they don't understand. Then as a customer, it's going to sound false, and it's going to sound unbelievable. And then the second thing as well is, obviously, if by giving them that training and then they understand why a particular wording or phrasing is critical because it's using these behavioral techniques, they're going to stick to that script. They understand the importance of it. And also, one of the key parts of the work that we do in contact centers is it's always informed by the knowledge and understanding of the people in the contact center. They are talking to customers all day. They have a great deal of experience and knowledge about what works with customers. And so a lot of the scripts that we would develop and the nudges we would develop is based on that. So, based on collecting that knowledge, collective knowledge that exists within the contact center. Someone might say, "Oh, I've found using this particular language or framing has been very effective," and we can say, "Oh, okay, well that's interesting because what you've done here, perhaps without realizing it, is you've used this particular bias, and that's why customers respond positively to it." So we can apply our knowledge of the science to say, right, this is something everyone should be doing, and standardize that. So, and as I'm sure many of your listeners will know, and I'm sure there's an art and a science to what works in terms of communicating with customers. There is, that's why, very few conversations are 100% scripted, is because, you're relying on the knowledge, the creativity, the empathy, the uniquely human skills that contact center staff have. And this is one area that's very interesting and something I wrote about in my book, which is about, the effective deployment of technology and things like chatbots and what chatbots can offer versus what humans can offer. One of the things that's uniquely human is we have that creativity, we have that empathy, and therefore, there is a lot of expertise that your staff will be using in how they communicate with customers, which they've just learned over time works, and they might not realize why it works. And so, we need to build that into what we do. And that's why the training component is so critical. And, we've delivered training to thousands of contact center staff now around these behavioral science techniques. And, what's great is that not only does that lead to a better outcome and better performance, but and measurable results, which we talk about in the white paper, but also I think staff really value it. And in fact, we've had really positive feedback on all the training that we do, because it's we're all curious about people, and if you work in a customer service or if you work in customer experience, that's a key part of your job, is understanding people and what motivates them and why they do what they do. So having more knowledge around that is something that people really enjoy and find useful, not just in their working lives, but I think in their personal lives as well.
there is more and more this say like the play between the human and the technology. There needs to be this understanding. What is the part of the role in that journey of technology and of humans, and how one can profit from the other, let's say? Is it going in that direction? And how do you actually reply to questions like that within a company?
Yeah. So in terms of, you mean where the role is for the human, where the role is for
Yeah.
the technology? Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, it's really interesting because I think, as I'm sure you'll be well aware of, and I'm sure many of your listeners are dealing with these challenges. What tends to happen when any new technology becomes available is there is a rush to adopt it, and the motivator for adopting it is often because of efficiency savings and cost savings. And this has certainly been true of technologies like chatbots, for example. Having a chatbot can replace any 100 FTEs or something in a contact center.
Yeah.
And that obviously then senior business decision makers are going, okay, well, that's going to boost profitability, so that's something we should be doing. And what happens is there's a rush to adoption of the technology, and then they find there are a certain number of use cases where it doesn't work, or it's having a negative impact in terms of quality of customer experience, customer outcomes, sales conversion, whatever it might be. And then the technology gets either rejected outright and they return to the previous model, or it just gets rolled back. And I think one of the interesting things about the use of these technologies, as I mentioned earlier, is that there are things that I'm not I guess I'm a pragmatist in terms of understanding that as humans, if we get a great experience from a brand, it doesn't matter to some extent whether that is delivered by a robot or a human. It's still a great experience. And and going back to what I was saying about context, in certain contexts, what we value is speed, efficiency, directness in the response that we want. So for certain low risk, low value transactions where we want something done quickly so we can get the outcome we want and get on with the rest of our day, a automated solution will deliver that more effectively. So that is ideal from a customer perspective. In other contexts where, particularly where there are challenges, and, whereby we might be, as a customer, we might be in a situation of high anxiety or high stress, the human element and the recognition of some of those non-human drivers is going to be more critical to us than speed and efficiency. And, and some creativity, some empathy, some understanding is going to be really highly valued. And those are things that only a human can deliver at the moment. And we in behavioral science, we talk about the distinction between system 1 and system 2 behavior. System 1 behavior is more instinctive, subconscious, is when we are prone to these behavioral biases that behavioral science has identified. And system 2 is when we're in a much more logical, rational, calm mode when we make decisions. And we tend to assume people are mostly in system 2 mode most of the time. What behavioral science tells us is we're mostly in system 1 mode most of the time. And we tend to behave more like Homer Simpson than we do like Spock from Star Trek in most contexts. And what that means is that, it doesn't mean we're stupid as humans. It just means we are prone to being irrational, to being emotional, to being influenced by these non-conscious factors. And the thing is, a bot, any machine learning based tool can only operate in system 2 mode, can only give a rational, logical response, because that's how they work. And they're based on these rules. They're defined by these rules, machine learning based algorithms. And so when people are in that system 1 mode and they're behaving in a non-rational way, and they are, stressed, angry, frustrated, something that's responding in a system 2 way to that is only going to make the situation worse. so I think that's the thing I would bear in mind is the two things that I think around adoption and use of these technologies, to recognize that whatever the nature of the transaction, whatever the nature of the interaction, there are contextual factors which might mean that people are
Mhm.
in that system one mode, and in fact, we should probably assume they're going to be in system one mode unless
Yeah.
we know better. And therefore there are going to be non-conscious factors at play. And if you're using a technological solution, you're using a chatbot, for example, you need to bear those in mind. And one of the ways that we do that, and the work that we do, is about, we can use the same techniques that we use with contact center staff to ensure the scripting and the language and the nudges that we employ are effective in doing that and addressing those. One way you can do that is you can try and get people from a system one into a system two mode. Get them to maybe slow down, think a bit more rationally. Be a bit more logical in terms of the way the customer responds. But there are going to be a lot of contexts whereby that's not enough, and a human will be the only way that you can respond to that positively. So it's a long answer, and there's a lot in my book around this. I think the way I would suggest is that businesses look at it is to think less about the the pure efficiencies that technology delivers, and think more about, okay, from a customer viewpoint, what is the optimal outcome that we want from this process, and therefore in those touch points, which is better to deliver that, a bot or a human? And recognize that in a lot of cases it might well be a human, and that's the way to look at it. The simple way of answering it, or the simple way of looking at it, is if you look at the jobs that are going to be most likely to be replaced by automation over the next 10, 20 years, they tend to be jobs where it's low skill, repetitive, the same process repeated over and over again. One of the things I always say is the beauty of a chatbot is it sticks to the script. It will deliver the same script 100 times out of 100. A human won't necessarily do that, but there are times when that's good, because you want them to deviate from the script to empathize with the customer situation. When you look at the jobs that aren't going to be replaced by automation in any time soon, it's things like teaching, medicine, jobs that require some creativity, some empathy, softer skills, and that have a real psychological foundation to them. How we educate our children, how we provide healthcare to people doesn't just require knowledge of medicine and the science behind that. Those, if you think about that in a customer experience context, the kind of experiences that people value, the softer skills that form part of that, those can't be replaced by a robot anytime soon. And therefore those are, if those are a key part of what people value about the customer experience and the brand, then you need to think carefully about what your automated solution is going to be before you employ them.
From a technology provider perspective, it would be worth as well maybe looking at, nevertheless, the behavioral science in order to create
Totally. Yeah.
the right maybe tool.
Yes.
Or might that be then as well?
Absolutely. Yeah. Because this is the thing. I don't want to overstate what I said. You might be thinking as if you are a customer experience manager or lead in your business, you might be thinking, well, because people really value some of those more intangible, softer skills that we provide in our customer experience, there's no role for an automated solution. And I would say, well, that's not true either, because, as I say, there are certain contexts. If you want to find out what time a store is open so you can go and visit it, you don't need to speak to a human to get that information. And it will be much more quick. It much be quicker and faster for you to go to the website to find that, or to go through an IVR where it gives you that information. Yeah. And people will be totally fine with that, because ultimately the primary goal, the job to be done for the customer in that context is find out when the store is open.
Yeah.
Anything else is irrelevant. So they are, so there's definitely a context for that. But what you can do, and where behavioral science adds value, and this is where we're talking to technology providers and where we're working with them on, is in the way that experience is delivered, and the language that's used, and the framing, and the techniques
Mm-hmm.
that's used
Mm-hmm.
can optimize that experience. So,
Yeah.
we've done work on IVR, for example, where
Oh, yeah.
we've used
Yeah.
nudge techniques within IVR to ensure that people get to the right place when they finally get through to the contact center if they need to speak to a person.
Okay.
That when they get to that person, they've got all the right information and they've got everything to hand that they need. So we worked with a client where they had a real problem whereby people needed some quite complex codes and references to build out a sort of payment plan with this particular for this particular service. And so one of the things we worked on was in the written communications that they got by letter or email. It said to nudge people, so say when you call, you need to have this information to hand, and they needed things
Yeah.
like household bills and things, utility
Okay.
bills and things like
Yeah.
that. So we made that simple as possible and easily understood as possible, so that when people called into the contact center, they had all the necessary information to hand, and it didn't mean repeat calls, but they had to call back with that information, and also the call would be shorter because they wouldn't then, it wouldn't be a case where they'd be on the phone and the agent would say, "Oh, okay, you need to have your most recent gas bill to hand." And they go, "Oh, okay, hang on a minute, I've got to go and find it." Put the phone,
Yeah.
I put them on hold for 2 minutes where they went and found it. So
Yeah.
those aspects are, those are things that we can help with, and that's scripting that could be applied by a bot. It doesn't need to be, and the language we can incorporate into that. And one of the things that we do when we do this kind of work, when we do cognition audits, looking at the scripting within bots and the languages, we will work with the brand guidelines and tone of voice as well, so that it's not only is it delivering the best experience and nudging the right behaviors from customers, it will also be making sure it sounds authentic and sounds relevant and right to that brand, because that's a key part of it as well.
Yes. Yeah. Now for the last question will be a more personal question. I would like to know from you, when was the last time that you were positively surprised by interacting with a company or a contact center?
Ooh, that's a really good question. Yeah. When was I pleasantly surprised? Well, one of the things one of the behavioral effects that I think I noticed the most, and I think achieves the biggest positive outcome for brands in customer experience, are things called Kano effects, which I don't know if you're familiar with. So this is kind of what you might call going the extra mile or delivering something unexpected to sort of surprise and delight a customer. So a small example is when you buy coffee in a cafe and they give you a chocolate or a biscuit or something alongside the coffee, which you haven't paid for and you weren't expecting. And it's a nice thing to have, and it's unexpected. Even if you don't eat it there and then, it gives you a nice, it makes you feel and benefit from the experience more. So, I'm always pleasantly surprised when those kind of things happen. And there was a very famous experiment that was done a number of years ago by I think it was by Robert Cialdini, who's an American behavioral science professor and expert, wrote a number of very successful books, and where they found that if in a restaurant, for example, at the end of the meal, when they bring out your bill, they found that if you gave the customers some like sweets with the bill, as a lot of restaurants do now, as I'm sure you've experienced, then that increases the amount of tip that people leave. No great surprise, really, that giving something free at the end of the meal like that, one of these Kano effects will increase the amount of that people get on the bill. But I've mentioned this because I experienced this quite recently, actually. But what they found was that if you did that and gave a couple of free sweets with the bill, but then as the waiter or waitress walks away and then comes back with a couple more sweets and says something like, "For you nice people, here are some extra sweets," then that increases the tip even more.
Oh, wow.
And I had something similar to this in a restaurant recently, where someone had given us a couple of sweets and then they came back over afterwards and went, here's a couple of extra ones for you because you've been really nice. And I knew what they were doing. I knew what the effect was, but it still made me feel great. And we still were like, this is a great restaurant. We should come back. And so that's those, and I think that's a really important point to make about all of these techniques is that I sometimes get asked the question about, well, if this is happening all the time, or lots of people are using these techniques, or we know we're being nudged in a particular context, does it still work? And the truth is it does, because however much we might be aware that someone is trying to influence our decisions, and we're never manipulating in what we do in behavioural science. People always have the freedom to choose to behave how they want. Behavioural science is about framing choices in a way that makes a desired behaviour more likely. However much we may know that someone is nudging us, because these things are hardwired into our brains, they're products of evolution over thousands and thousands of years. We can't stop them. Trying to prevent them from having an effect is no more successful than trying to pretend the sky isn't blue. It's just a fact of life. And so, in that context, in that restaurant, I knew exactly what they were doing, but it still made me. I still gave them a nice tip and said we go back another time. So those kind of things, those kind of Kano effects, when I see them, I always think that's nice, and also it does have a big impact, and it's a good example, I think, as well, because those are the kind of things that when we're in a drive for efficiency for businesses, cutting costs or whatever, they tend to be the first things that we get rid of. But they're not. They are the things that actually we might be underestimating the value that they provide.
Thank you, Richard, for your time, for your talk, and for explaining to us behavioral science. It was a pleasure, really, to getting to know more and to dive into all that topic. And for you, dear listeners, please. Your book is available, I guess, as well on Amazon, Behavioral Business. If you want to know more about it, go get the book.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure. Yes.
Thank you very much, Richard.